A millionaire CEO thought he had it all, until three 6-year-old girls in pink dresses walked into his office with resumes, and called him Daddy. New York buzzed beneath a silver morning sky, the kind that stretched endlessly above steel and glass. Inside one of Manhattan's most elite skyscrapers, the top floor pulsed with the quiet intensity of high-stakes business. The office of Brightcore's CEO was a minimalist masterpiece: sleek marble floors, cold metallic lines, and a massive wall of glass looking out over the city like the throne room of a modern king. At the center of it sat Andrew Blake, a man used to commanding silence without ever raising his voice. Andrew was the kind of figure who never looked rushed, even when markets were crashing. In his light-colored designer suit and polished Italian shoes, he appeared carved out of calm itself. His dark hair was trimmed with surgical precision, and his icy blue eyes scanned the screen in front of him, already 10 steps ahead of everyone else. At 38, he had what most men only dreamed of: power, wealth, control. He had no children, no family, no mess. Or so he thought. That illusion shattered at precisely 9:03 a.m. His secretary's voice came through the intercom, uncertain in a way that immediately caught his attention. "Mr. Blake, there are 3 little girls here. They say they have an appointment with you." He frowned, leaning forward. "Children? What department sent them up?" There was a pause, then, "They didn't come with anyone. They're alone. And they insist you're expecting them." Before he could respond, the door swung open, and in came the strangest sight his office had ever seen. 3 girls, maybe 5 or 6 years old, marched in with purpose. Each wore a light pink dress, ruffled and slightly wrinkled as if they'd been sitting on the subway too long. They had matching yellow backpacks with tiny glitter stars and white sneakers that squeaked on the marble floor. All 3 had thick, dark hair falling in uneven waves past their shoulders and eyes that gleamed the same impossible blue as his own. They walked straight toward his desk, lined up like little soldiers, and placed what looked like hand-drawn resumes in front of him. "Hello, Mr. Blake," the one in the center said with a serious tone. "We came to apply for a job." Andrew blinked, completely thrown off. The girl to the left added helpfully, "We're good at drawing. And singing. And counting to 100. "We brought our resumes," said the third, lifting her yellow backpack and pulling out a sheet of paper filled with hearts and stick figures. Before Andrew could speak, the middle girl added something that stopped his breath cold. "Our mommy is in the hospital. She said you're our daddy." Silence, dense and unmovable, fell across the room. Andrew looked from one girl to the next. They were triplets. Identical. And staring at him like they'd practiced this moment over and over. The one with freckles pointed to the drawings. "She told us if we get to you, you'll know what to do. She said this is your office. That you're the boss of everything here." He stood slowly, unable to ignore the way his pulse had spiked. "Your mother's name. What is it?" "Sophie," they said together. "Sophie Carter." The name hit him like a crash behind the eyes. Sophie. He hadn't heard it in years. Not since the two of them were tangled in something passionate, fragile, and doomed from the start. She had disappeared from his life one day without a word, no note, no goodbye. He searched for her, called, emailed, even hired someone to look. Nothing. She had simply vanished. Now, out of nowhere, 3 little girls who looked exactly like him were standing in his office, asking for a job and claiming to be his daughters. One of them reached up, slipping her tiny hand into his. Her fingers were warm and shaking slightly. "Please," she said softly. "Mommy said if we didn't find you soon, they'd take us away." Andrew Blake, master of negotiations and ruthless boardroom battles, found himself lost for words for the first time in years. There were no spreadsheets, no charts, no quarterly reports that could prepare him for this. He looked down at the girls, at their identical faces, at their trembling chins, at their matching hope, and knew that everything he thought he understood about his life had just been rewritten. The meeting he had scheduled for 9:15 would have to wait. The office remained silent long after the girls had sat down on the plush leather sofa across from Andrew's desk. He hadn't said much, hadn't moved much either. The only thing he had done was cancel his entire day's schedule with one quiet instruction to his assistant: clear everything. I need time. He didn't offer the girls juice or snacks, didn't pretend to smile or ask them questions about school or hobbies. He simply stared, at their faces, their hands, the way one of them picked at the hem of her dress nervously, while another swung her legs over the edge of the couch, too short to reach the floor. Their resemblance to Sophie was there, faint and soft, the shape of their lips, a particular tilt of the head, but their eyes were unmistakable. They were his. That thought repeated in his mind like a drumbeat, relentless and impossible to quiet. He remembered Sophie so vividly now it ached. She had been wildfire wrapped in silk, quick to laugh, impossible to pin down, and completely different from anyone he had ever met. They had spent one blazing summer together, tangled up in late-night rooftop talks, impulsive road trips, and quiet mornings in his old apartment when she made pancakes and danced barefoot to jazz. It hadn't lasted long, but it had burned brightly, and then, without warning, she disappeared. One morning she just didn't come back. No call, no letter. Her phone number stopped working. He had gone to her apartment only to find it empty, stripped of anything personal. She had vanished like she never existed. He had tried to find her, he had the money and the means, but she had covered her tracks well. Eventually, he had stopped trying, but not because he stopped caring. He stopped because it began to feel like chasing a ghost. And now, after all this time, 3 living, breathing pieces of her sat in front of him. "Where's your mother now?" he asked finally, his voice lower than usual, careful not to startle them. It was the girl in the middle who spoke again. She seemed to be the leader, or at least the most composed. "She's in the hospital," she said, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. "She got very sick a few months ago. First, she had trouble breathing. Then she got tired all the time. She said it's something called stage 4. Andrew felt the words hit his chest like a stone. He didn't need a medical degree to know what that meant. Another girl added, "She said it's not going away. The medicine isn't working anymore." "We were living with a neighbor," the third one said softly, "but then Miss Claire said she couldn't take care of us. Mommy told us where to find you. She said you'd be scared when you saw us, but that you're good. She said you'd take care of us if anything happened." Andrew rubbed a hand across his face, unable to process the speed at which the ground beneath his feet had shifted. The facts were clear and terrifying. Sophie had been pregnant when she left. Not with one child, 3. She had given birth, raised them alone for 6 years, hidden them from him for reasons he didn't yet understand, and now was dying. Dying, and trusting him, a man who hadn't even known they existed, to protect them. It felt like stepping onto a stage mid-performance and realizing the entire audience had been watching your life without your knowledge. He rose and walked to the bar cart near the window, not for alcohol, but simply to do something with his hands. He poured a glass of water, stared at the skyline, and then turned back toward the girls. "I need to see her," he said. They nodded, all 3 at once, as if it had already been decided. "She's at Memorial," said the one with the braid. "Room 513. Do you know if she wants to see me?" "She said she hoped you would come," the middle one replied. "But she didn't want to make you feel trapped. That's why she didn't call. She said she wanted us to meet you first. So you'd know we're real." He sat down heavily in the armchair across from them, and for a moment, there was only the distant hum of traffic through the windows and the quiet shuffling of little shoes. "She also said," the youngest girl whispered, "that she forgave you." The words hit him like ice. He had been the one abandoned. The one left without answers. But now, in the presence of these small girls who didn't ask for any of this, his sense of betrayal began to shift into something else entirely, guilt, maybe. Or responsibility. Or a deep, unexpected ache that felt a lot like regret. He had no idea how to be a father. He didn't even know where to start. But somehow, looking into their eyes, he knew there was no going back. The waiting room outside the hospital's oncology wing smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee. Andrew sat there, his usually immaculate suit wrinkled at the cuffs, his fingers tangled together in a rare display of nervous energy. It had been 2 days since the girls had walked into his life and shattered everything he thought he knew. Now, he was here, not as a CEO or a public figure, but as a man who might be about to meet the woman who had once left without a word, and perhaps the only woman who had ever truly mattered to him. The drive over had been quiet. The triplets, Mia, Hazel, and Lily, sat in the back seat of his town car, unusually solemn. They didn't ask for music or snacks or cartoons. Instead, they held hands and stared out the windows as if they were preparing for something they couldn't quite name. He'd offered to come alone, but they had refused with silent, determined looks, the kind that told him these girls had already seen more than they should have. A nurse finally led them through a maze of white-walled corridors and softly beeping machines to room 513. When the door opened, the breath caught in Andrew's throat. Sophie lay propped up against a stack of pillows, her skin pale, her frame thinner than he remembered. Her hair, once thick and wild, was now tucked into a silk scarf, and though the light in her eyes had dimmed, it was still undeniably her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The girls ran to her immediately, crawling into the narrow bed with the unself-conscious ease of children who didn't know how fragile the human body could be. She held them close, kissed the tops of their heads, then looked up and met Andrew's gaze. A faint, tired smile curved her lips. "You came." He stepped forward slowly, unsure of what words to use, unsure if any would be enough. "I did." She patted the edge of the bed, a quiet invitation. He hesitated, then sat beside her, careful not to disturb the cluster of medical tubes and wires. For a long time, they didn't speak. The girls were whispering something to each other about the hospital food and how it tasted like paper. It gave them a layer of privacy he hadn't expected. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know where you were." "You disappeared, Sophie." "I searched. I tried." "I know," she said gently. "And I was watching you the whole time. I just couldn't let you find me." He turned to look at her, eyebrows furrowed. "Why?" Her eyes shimmered, but not with tears. More like years of buried emotion rising to the surface. "Because I was scared. Because I was pregnant and I didn't think you'd want it. Not one baby, 3. I could barely wrap my head around it myself. And you were already building something so huge, so far from the chaos I was living in. I didn't want to be another burden, or another wound." His voice cracked slightly when he spoke. "You should have let me decide." "I know," she said again. "But by the time I felt brave enough to call, they were toddlers. And then I got sick. And then it just got worse. There was always a reason to wait." He exhaled sharply, trying to process the timeline that had unfolded without him. "So when you told them about me, was that a backup plan?" She didn't get defensive. Instead, she looked at him with something much deeper than pride or apology. "It was hope. I told them you were kind. I didn't know if it was fair. But I remembered who you were. The real you. Not the magazine covers, or the headlines. The man who once skipped a board meeting to stay in bed and read poetry with me. The man who gave cab drivers $100 tips because they looked tired. I wanted them to know that man, even if I wasn't around to see it." Andrew felt something shift inside him, guilt, yes, but also a slow, warm current of grief. He looked at the girls, now sitting quietly in a circle at the foot of the bed, drawing on the back of hospital charts with crayons a nurse had given them. They were so real, so alive, and so astonishingly his. I want to take care of them, he said finally, the words landing like a vow. Not just temporarily. I want to be their father. Properly. I'll do whatever I have to. Sophie didn't cry, though her breath hitched. She nodded, her hand reaching for his. Thank you. That's all I needed to hear. Later that day, Andrew made the arrangements. A court-approved DNA test was ordered, though even before the results came back, no one who saw them together could have doubted their connection. The girls, who had been calling him Mr. Blake out of habit, started slipping in a quiet "Dad" here and there, testing the word like a new language. And when the results did arrive, conclusive and clear, he held the paper in his hands and understood that this was the beginning of something he couldn't yet define, but already couldn't live without. Andrew had signed the paperwork without hesitation, the legal language barely registering in his mind. Custody was initially marked as temporary, an emergency placement due to their mother's condition, but he already knew there was nothing temporary about what he felt. The day he brought the girls home, the penthouse felt more like a museum than ever. The sleek glass walls, minimalist furniture, and muted gray color palette, once the epitome of modern success, now seemed cold, sterile, and vastly unprepared for 3 6-year-olds with glitter-stained fingers and endless energy. The first hour had been chaotic. Hazel knocked over a sculpture that Andrew didn't even remember owning, Lily cried because there was no pink toothpaste, and Mia attempted to climb the kitchen counter to reach the cereal on the top shelf. Andrew stood frozen in the middle of it all, completely overwhelmed by how unqualified he was to manage any of it. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers, handled international crises, and stood before rooms of hostile investors with unwavering confidence, but now, faced with the daily logistics of parenting, he felt like a man tossed into the ocean with no idea how to swim. He'd hired help, of course. A highly recommended nanny named Serena arrived the next morning, punctual and professional, with references and a clipboard. She had been trained in early childhood development and spoke 3 languages fluently. Andrew thought she might be the solution to everything. The girls disagreed. They refused her routines, ignored her rules, and insisted on eating breakfast sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor. By the end of the second day, Serena resigned politely, her smile strained and eyes slightly wild. Andrew tried a different approach. He brought in tutors, child psychologists, even a private chef who specialized in kid-friendly nutrition. None of it worked. Mia declared that the chef's green smoothies tasted like sadness. Hazel asked if the tutor could teach her how to make explosions instead of long division. Lily locked herself in the bathroom and cried until he sat on the floor outside the door and read every page of a princess book aloud through the wood. It became clear that they didn't want structure. They wanted him. They followed him everywhere. Into his office, into the gym, even into early morning meetings over Zoom. One afternoon, he found them sitting quietly under his desk while he delivered a presentation to an international board of directors. When he tried to shoo them out, Mia whispered, "But this is your cave. We're your little bears." That was the day he stopped closing his office door. He began to learn, slowly and clumsily, how to be theirs. He learned how to braid hair, though his fingers were all thumbs and the results were lumpy. He learned to wake up early to make pancakes in funny shapes, sometimes they looked like dinosaurs, sometimes just puddles, but the girls cheered for them anyway. He learned that Hazel needed a nightlight shaped like the moon, that Lily hated loud noises unless they came from fireworks, and that Mia liked to fall asleep listening to the sound of rain on headphones, even when it wasn't raining. They changed everything. They left crayons in his briefcase, bubble wands in his car, glitter on his expensive shirts. His pristine office began to gather fingerprints and juice boxes and scribbled drawings taped next to financial charts. For the first time in his adult life, Andrew missed meetings because of school performances, forgot conference calls because of stomach bugs, and canceled business trips because Lily asked if he'd still be her daddy even when he went away. He started to answer to "Dad." At first, it felt surreal, like he was pretending to be someone he wasn't. But over time, it stopped feeling like an act. It became something solid, something real. Something he was becoming. One night, maybe 3 weeks in, he was standing in the hallway outside their bedroom. The girls were asleep, tangled in pink sheets, clutching stuffed animals with wild hair and missing eyes. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the city outside. Andrew leaned against the wall and closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him, but it wasn't the same kind of tired he felt after long work days. This was deeper, but also more peaceful. It felt like purpose. He didn't know exactly when the shift happened, when the sense of duty turned into something more like devotion, but he knew that if someone had asked him right then what the most important thing in his life was, the answer wouldn't have been his company, or his money, or even his name. It would have been 3 little girls in mismatched pajamas, sleeping down the hall. It happened on a Thursday morning, the kind Andrew had come to expect as part of his new life, chaotic, loud, and completely unpredictable. He had woken up to the sound of whispered giggles and the distant crash of something hitting the marble floor. By the time he entered the kitchen, barefoot and still half-dressed, all 3 girls were sitting at the island counter wearing child-sized business suits, clip-on ties, and oversized sunglasses that looked suspiciously like a pair he had misplaced weeks ago. Mia stood on a stool, pouring orange juice into 4 mugs labeled, "World's Best CEO," while Hazel and Lily shuffled through papers that were clearly printed off one of his home office computers. "What," he said, rubbing sleep from his eyes, "is this?" Hazel adjusted her sunglasses with the gravitas of a tiny executive. "We're ready for the meeting, Mr. Blake." Mia nodded. "We have ideas for the company." Before he could ask what company they were referring to, Lily slid a document across the counter toward him. It was titled, "Operation, Make Work More Fun," complete with pie charts drawn in colored pencil and several glitter stickers stuck haphazardly around the border. The first bullet point read, "More snack breaks for everyone. Snacks equals energy equals profit." The second, "Let people wear fun clothes on Fridays. Suits are boring. Maybe even costumes sometimes." The third, "Less yelling, more hugging. Hugging boosts morale." We Googled it. He stared at the paper for a long moment, then looked up at them. "Are you seriously planning to come to the office like this?" "We already packed our bags," Mia said brightly. "We have markers, snacks, and emergency unicorn band-aids." Against his better judgment and every instinct he had as a corporate leader, Andrew let them come. That afternoon, the elevator doors to Brightcore's executive floor slid open with a soft chime, and out marched the girls, still in their miniature suits, each holding a tiny clipboard and wearing expressions of complete confidence. The receptionist blinked in confusion. A senior advisor dropped his coffee. And Andrew, walking behind them with a face that dared anyone to question this, simply said, "They're shadowing me today." The reactions were immediate and varied. Some employees smiled and whispered. Others looked terrified. But no one said a word out loud, because Andrew Blake never brought guests, let alone 6-year-old girls in pink sneakers, into the war room where the board made decisions that shaped the future of the company. They sat through the first 15 minutes of the operations meeting without a word, legs swinging under the high-backed chairs, chewing on apple slices while the heads of departments reviewed analytics. Then, during a tense discussion on employee retention, Lily raised her hand. "Excuse me," she said politely, "have you considered giving out stickers when people do a good job?" Silence fell like a dropped pin. One of the managers coughed. Another shifted awkwardly in her chair. Andrew didn't say a word. He just leaned back and looked at the board, waiting. Hazel took the opportunity to jump in. "My teacher says people work harder when they feel happy. You should let everyone wear pajamas to work once a month. You'll get more smiles. Smiles mean less quitting." Mia pulled out a page from her folder and held it up like it was the closing argument of a courtroom drama. "We made a graph. It's not real numbers, but it feels right." Someone, no one was quite sure who, laughed. Then another. Then the CFO chuckled so hard he nearly spilled his water. Within minutes, the tension that had weighed down the room cracked and gave way to something else entirely: joy. Lightness. Something that hadn't been felt in those walls for a long time. Andrew watched it unfold with a strange mix of pride and disbelief. These children, without even trying, had managed to accomplish something that no strategy session or leadership retreat had ever achieved. They made the company feel human again. That night, an employee posted a blurry picture on social media of the triplets sitting at the board table with the caption, "New management at Brightcore. Things are looking up." The post went viral within hours. Journalists called. Bloggers speculated. Headlines appeared: CEO's secret weapon, his 6-year-old daughters. Andrew didn't care about the buzz. What mattered was what he saw in his employees: the shift, the laughter, the shared stories over coffee the next day about the kid who asked for more hugs in the workplace. Brightcore's mood changed. Productivity didn't drop. In fact, it rose. More importantly, people smiled more in the elevators. They lingered longer in conversations. For the first time, the company didn't just look successful, it felt alive. Later that weekend, after the girls had gone to bed, Andrew sat at his desk looking at one of the graphs they'd made, colored bars labeled fun, snacks, hugs, and bored. The fun column was the highest by far. He smiled to himself, tapped a pen on the desk, and quietly wondered how he'd gone so long without understanding what really mattered. He'd built an empire, but these girls had given it a soul. The hospital visits became routine, though nothing about them ever felt normal. Every few days, Andrew would load the girls into the car, help them buckle into their seats, and drive across the city to Memorial Hospital, where Sophie remained in room 513. The girls always brought her drawings, handmade cards, and tiny gifts: a paper flower, a string bracelet, a rock they found in Central Park that looked kind of like a heart. They would climb into the hospital bed beside her, all three squeezed close, as if by pressing their bodies to hers they could hold back whatever was coming. Sophie smiled every time, even when her skin grew paler and her movements slower, even when her voice grew thin like tracing paper. Andrew never brought work with him to the hospital. He left his phone on silent, his laptop shut. In those sterile white walls, there were no deals to be made, no clients to impress, only moments to witness and protect. Sometimes he sat quietly in the corner, watching as Sophie braided Hazel's hair with shaky hands or taught Mia how to fold paper cranes. Other times, he read aloud when her throat was too sore, stories from children's books and, once, from a battered poetry collection Sophie had loved when they were younger. She listened with her eyes closed, smiling at the sound of his voice like it anchored her to the world. One rainy afternoon, after the girls had fallen asleep in a makeshift pile on the sofa beneath a hospital blanket, Sophie asked Andrew to step outside with her. She had refused a wheelchair that day, insisting on walking slowly with an 4-pole in one hand and his arm in the other. They stood together in the small courtyard behind the building, the drizzle turning her scarf darker at the edges. Her face looked translucent in the dim light, but her eyes were steady. "I need to say things while I still can," she said softly. Andrew didn't argue. He simply nodded and waited. "I never meant to keep them from you. I told myself it was protection, but the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid you'd take one look at all that chaos and turn away. But I was wrong. You were never the one who ran." He looked down, jaw tight. "I should have looked harder. I gave up." "No," she said gently, "you didn't. You were living. I was hiding. That's not your fault." She leaned against his shoulder, and he instinctively steadied her. For a long while, they just stood there, silent. Then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're going to need you soon. Not as a replacement. Just, as something solid. Something that doesn't disappear." He looked at her, at the fragility of her, and felt something like grief press against his ribs, tight and sharp. "I don't know if I'm enough for them. I still don't know what I'm doing." No one does, she said with a tired laugh. But you love them. They know that. And they don't need perfection. They need presence. You've already given them more than I ever could have imagined. He didn't reply. He just held her hand, cold and light in his. Sophie died 3 nights later, in her sleep, with the girls curled beside her like kittens. The hospital called at dawn, and Andrew arrived before the sun fully rose. When he entered the room, it was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of the machines that no longer mattered. The nurse met his eyes and nodded, then gently left them alone. The girls didn't cry right away. It was Lily who noticed first, her small voice breaking the silence. "Mommy's not breathing." Andrew moved quickly, but not to panic. He knelt beside the bed and placed his hand gently on Sophie's chest. The absence was immediate, a silence too vast to fill. Mia looked at him with wide eyes, her voice trembling. "Is she sleeping?" He shook his head slowly. "No, baby. She's gone." Hazel crawled into his lap and buried her face in his chest. Lily clung to his side. Mia stayed near the bed, watching her mother's face like she couldn't believe it wouldn't move again. Andrew held all 3 of them for a long time. He didn't rush. He didn't pretend to have answers. He let them cry, let them ask the same questions over and over. When the sun finally rose over the city outside, its light pouring into the room like gold, Sophie looked almost at peace. The funeral was small. Sophie had left instructions, nothing formal, nothing grand. Just people who knew her, a few songs she loved, and white daisies, her favorite flowers. The girls wore simple white dresses. Andrew stood beside them, not in the front row, not above them, but next to them, his hand always close. When Mia wanted to speak, he knelt beside her at the podium and whispered encouragement into her ear until she found the words. When Hazel cried uncontrollably in the middle of the service, he lifted her into his arms and didn't put her down for the rest of the ceremony. That night, back at home, the girls were quiet. Dinner went untouched. The house felt heavier than ever. Andrew sat with them on the living room floor, surrounded by pillows and blankets, and told them stories about their mother, how she once danced in the rain in the middle of Times Square, how she had a laugh that could turn any mood around, how she used to say, "Love is not a promise, it's a practice." Lily fell asleep first, her thumb in her mouth, her head on Andrew's lap. Hazel followed not long after. But Mia stayed awake, eyes red and raw, staring at the ceiling. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. Andrew didn't answer right away. He looked around the room, at the art they'd drawn on the walls, at the stuffed animals now gathered in corners, at the photos he'd taken of them over the past few weeks already framed and hanging above the fireplace. "Yes," he said finally, brushing her hair back from her face. "We are. It's going to hurt. But we're going to be okay. Because we're together." It wasn't a dramatic promise or a grand declaration. It was simple and quiet and real. And for the first time in days, Mia closed her eyes and let herself sleep. Spring came slowly that year, as if the city itself were trying to move gently forward in the aftermath of so much change. The air grew warmer, the parks turned green again, and in Andrew's home, once a sterile palace of steel and silence, there was now color, noise, and the constant motion of 3 growing girls finding their way through grief and childhood at the same time. It wasn't easy. There were nights when one of them would wake up crying, calling for a mother who would not come back. There were mornings when breakfast ended in sudden tears, triggered by something as simple as a missing spoon or a crumpled drawing. But there was also laughter, unexpected, loud, and contagious. It snuck in between the sadness and slowly began to take up space. Andrew found himself changing more than he thought possible. At work, he started arriving later and leaving earlier. His once flawless punctuality had been replaced with school drop-offs, PTA meetings, and last-minute bake sale contributions he usually forgot until the night before. His assistants learned to block out certain hours labeled only as "dad time," and no one dared question it. For the first time, Andrew's life wasn't built entirely around profit margins and quarterly forecasts. It was built around routines that made no sense on a balance sheet but felt more important than anything else: morning cuddles, bath time songs, packing lunchboxes with silly notes tucked inside. It didn't take long before the girls began carving out their own identities in his world, in ways that surprised and delighted him. Mia, always the artist, started leaving drawings everywhere. Some were taped to the office walls, others slipped into folders that executives opened mid-meeting to find stick figures of people holding hands or giant suns with smiling faces. One of her crayon masterpieces, a portrait of Andrew holding all three girls with the caption, "My dad is the best boss," ended up in a corporate newsletter when someone scanned it by accident. It went viral within days. Instead of being embarrassed, Andrew asked the design team to frame it. It now hung behind his desk. Hazel, more inquisitive and bold, took a liking to technology. One weekend, she asked to borrow his old tablet and, by Monday, had created a mock website called Hazel Tech, complete with a logo and a blog post titled "Things Adults Should Learn from Kids." Her list included items like, "Don't yell when you're hungry, take more naps," and "Say sorry even if you don't mean it at first." Amused, Andrew helped her turn it into a small project. With the help of his IT department, they built a real version of Hazel's site. Within weeks, other kids started submitting their own advice, and soon they were getting emails from teachers asking if they could use the content in classrooms. Lily, the quietest of the three, bloomed in her own unexpected way. She had a softness to her, a gentleness that made people lean in when she spoke. One morning, after watching a video about a charity helping children without homes, she asked Andrew if they could do something to help. Not wanting to brush her off, he told her she could come up with a plan and they'd talk about it. The next day, she presented a hand-drawn flyer titled Lily's Little Hearts Project. She wanted to send care boxes with books, stuffed animals, and notes to children in hospitals or shelters. Andrew took it seriously. He brought it to the company's philanthropy board, and soon Brightcore launched a new initiative in Lily's name. She gave her first speech, standing on a crate in front of employees in the company atrium, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger with every word. She ended with, "We don't have to be big to be kind. We just have to start." The girls weren't just adapting to life with Andrew, they were reshaping it. And through them, the company began to shift too. Policies became more family-friendly. Mental health days were introduced. Office events included "Bring Your Kid to Work" months instead of days. Employees started bringing drawings and handmade gifts to decorate their desks. The culture of Brightcore, once sharp and relentless, softened without losing its edge. Investors noticed the shift in energy and called it innovative. Analysts praised Andrew for modern emotional leadership. But Andrew didn't care about the headlines. He cared about the mornings when Mia asked if he could walk her to school holding her hand. He cared about the night Hazel told him she liked it better when he messed up the bedtime story voices because it sounds funnier when you try too hard. He cared about the way Lily started humming again when she was drawing, something Sophie had told him she used to do before the sickness made her quiet. There was a moment one Saturday afternoon, as they all lay on a picnic blanket in Central Park, when Andrew looked up at the sky and realized something he hadn't been able to put into words until then. He wasn't just surviving fatherhood. He was growing into it. And the girls, in all their chaos and brilliance, weren't just fitting into his world, they had rebuilt it from the inside out. They hadn't saved him from his loneliness, they had replaced it entirely with something louder, messier, and infinitely more alive. It was nearly a year to the day since the girls had first walked into his office, clutching their yellow backpacks and hand-drawn resumes, and in that time, Andrew Blake's life had changed so completely that the man he used to be felt like a distant echo. The penthouse no longer echoed with silence but with music, footsteps, and the endless chatter of three voices always asking, always imagining, always needing. His home had transformed into a place of life, not curated perfection, but real, vivid, sometimes messy life. Crayon marks on the walls, laundry that never seemed to end, and stray glitter still clinging to the edges of his briefcase were part of the daily rhythm now. And he wouldn't have traded any of it. On the anniversary of Sophie's passing, Andrew didn't go to the office. He made pancakes instead, Sophie's recipe, slightly burned at the edges the way the girls liked them. They spent the morning in pajamas, watching old videos of Sophie reading bedtime stories or singing lullabies. The girls cried a little, then laughed when Sophie did that silly voice she used to use for fairy tale villains. It hurt, but it was gentle hurt now, wrapped in memory and love, not in sharp loss. Healing had come slowly, not in one moment, but in thousands of small ones. Later that afternoon, while organizing a drawer in his study, Andrew came across the resumes the girls had first given him that day in his office. He sat down on the edge of the bed and unfolded each sheet, his eyes lingering on the crooked handwriting, the hearts in the margins, the way Lily had spelled experience as experience. He read every line as if for the first time, and something inside him ached, in that good, unbearable way that only comes from knowing just how much you've gained after almost losing everything. One page in particular caught his attention. Mia's resume. Under, "Why do you want to work here?" she had written in big, uneven letters, "So we can be with Daddy." That single line undid him more than any headline, any award, any stock market high ever could. He didn't cry often, but he did then. Not from sadness. From awe. From the impossible wonder of how these three little girls had walked into his office demanding a job and somehow filled the vacancy in his heart he hadn't even known was there. He had the pages framed the next day. Now, when people entered his office, visitors, investors, new employees, they all noticed the three simple frames hanging above the couch, next to sleek modern art and accolades from Fortune and Forbes. Some smiled. Some asked about them. Andrew always answered with the same quiet pride, "Those are my most important hires." Word about his transformation had spread beyond the company. Articles called him the human CEO, the man who had brought heart back into corporate leadership. Podcasts invited him to speak, profiles were written, and his once stone-faced reputation was now layered with warmth and presence. None of it mattered to him as much as the look in the girls' eyes when they ran into his arms at the end of each school day. He had traded polished solitude for a wild, unpredictable kind of love that didn't care about meetings or schedules. He had learned how to tie ballet shoes, how to wash crayon off suede, how to argue with 6-year-olds about bedtime and still be outnumbered 3-1. He had learned how to parent not from books, but from listening, to their fears, their joy, their nonsense, and their wisdom. Each of the girls had changed too. Mia had started entering art contests and recently had one of her pieces displayed in a children's gallery. Hazel had begun building her own computer game with help from bright core developers, and her blog was now read by kids and teachers across the country. Lily had expanded her Care Box project to include birthday letters to children who had no one else to celebrate with. They weren't just thriving, they were creating worlds from their pain, building joy out of what they'd lost. And Andrew, standing in the middle of it all, often marveled at how resilient love could be when given the space to grow. One night, as he was tucking them into bed, Hazel asked him the question he hadn't expected. "Are we really your daughters now? Not just kinda." He looked at her, then at Mia and Lily, both waiting quietly for the answer. He reached into the drawer of the bedside table and pulled out 3 small boxes, each wrapped in soft gold paper. The girls opened them to find delicate bracelets, custom-made. Each one had a charm, a tiny heart, a star, and a key. On the inside of the bands, engraved in tiny script, was the same phrase on all 3, chosen. Loved. Forever. "You're not kinda anything," he said, his voice steady. "You're mine. In every way that matters. And nothing, not ever, will change that." The girls tackled him with hugs, their tiny arms wrapping around his neck, and in that moment, with their laughter filling the room and their hearts wrapped around his, Andrew knew the truth he hadn't dared to believe before: he hadn't just been given a second chance at family, he had built one. Not by accident. Not by obligation. But by choice. And that choice, every single day, was the best one he had ever made. This story, at its core, is about rediscovery, of love, of identity, and of purpose. What begins as a shocking revelation transforms into something much deeper than just a man meeting his daughters. It's a journey from isolation to intimacy, from control to connection. Andrew doesn't simply accept fatherhood, he is broken open by it, reshaped by the chaos and vulnerability it demands. What I find most powerful is that the girls aren't just background characters or passive children waiting to be saved, they're the emotional architects of Andrew's transformation. They pull him out of the glass tower of his curated life and teach him how to live without armor. And that's what makes the ending so satisfying. It's not perfect, not tied up with unrealistic simplicity. But it's real, earned, and deeply human. This isn't a fairy tale where love arrives fully formed. It's a love story built brick by brick through bedtime stories, kitchen disasters, grief, and small moments of courage. And in the end, that's the kind of happy ending that feels not only possible, but profoundly deserved. He left her because she couldn't give him a child, for years later, he saw her with a little girl who had his eyes. Andrew Blake's home was immaculate, elegant, and empty. A sprawling estate overlooking the water, it had been designed to impress, to reflect power and precision, qualities Andrew was known for in every corner of the business world. Yet behind the flawless walls and curated furniture, there was a silence that clung to everything. It wasn't peace. It was absence. The kind that creeps into your bones when the person you once loved no longer walks through the door. He had left her, Celia, the woman who once painted colors into his monochrome life, 4 years ago. At the time, he told himself it was logical. They had tried everything to start a family. Doctors, specialists, procedures. Every month brought hope, followed by disappointment. Celia had suffered quietly, her smiles becoming rarer, her light dimming more each year. And Andrew, who thrived on solutions, couldn't fix it. He grew distant, restless, and bitter, not toward her, but toward the silence in the nursery that never held a child. The day he left, he didn't pack much. Just a suitcase and a few lines rehearsed like business strategy. "It's not your fault. I just can't live like this anymore." Celia didn't cry. She stood in the doorway, barefoot, her hair pulled back, paint smudged on her shirt, and said nothing. That silence haunted him more than any scream would have. Now, 4 years later, Andrew had everything he thought he wanted. His company had doubled in value. He was on the cover of magazines, had dined with politicians, and had just bought a new penthouse in Manhattan. But when he came home each night, it was always to silence. Not even the city below could drown it out. Sometimes he thought of her, where she might be, whether she still painted, if she ever regretted letting him go so easily. Other times, he told himself it didn't matter. He had made a choice, and he had built his empire without distraction. That should have been enough. But it wasn't. One evening, after another long day filled with strategy meetings and perfectly meaningless conversations, Andrew found himself driving without a destination. The car moved through quiet streets, passing shops and people and places that felt more alive than he had in weeks. He pulled over outside a small art gallery on a corner he didn't recognize. The windows were fogged, but through the glass he could make out soft lights and watercolor canvases hanging on the walls. Something pulled at him. He didn't go in, but he stared for a long time, until the clerk inside turned and caught his gaze. Embarrassed, he turned the key and drove off. He hadn't thought about Celia in weeks, not really. But that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he saw her again. Not the woman in the gallery windows, but the one who used to fall asleep with paint on her fingers and hope in her heart. The one he had left behind when life didn't go according to plan. And for the first time in years, he wondered not just what she was doing, but whether she had ever forgiven him. The next morning, Andrew woke up restless, his mind replaying images he hadn't invited, Celia's face in the soft morning light, the quiet way she used to tilt her head when she was painting, the nervous way she would laugh when he caught her dancing barefoot in the kitchen. These memories came not like a flood, but like raindrops, small, cold, and impossible to ignore. He tried to push them away, like he always had, but something felt different this time. It was as if the part of him he'd buried with their marriage was finally clawing its way back to the surface. He didn't go to the office that morning. Instead, he sat in his car outside a coffee shop they used to visit years ago. It was still there, same awning, same chalkboard sign offering handwritten quotes with your latte. Back then, Celia had always smiled at the silly tradition. He remembered one she kept in her wallet for months, asterisk, some storms come to clear your path. Asterisk, she'd said it was about them. At the time, he had only half listened. Now he couldn't stop listening to the past. With a sudden impulse, he pulled out his phone and searched her name. Nothing concrete. No website, no recent exhibits. He scrolled further, then deeper into social media. After nearly 20 minutes, he found a tagged photo. It wasn't much, just a blurry snapshot of a community art fair, but there she was, standing in front of an easel, her hair longer now, her smile softer, more inward. She wasn't alone. In the corner of the photo, just visible at the edge of the frame, was a small hand gripping hers. Andrew stared at the photo for a long time. Something twisted deep in his chest. The girl, he could only assume it was a girl, was mostly out of the shot. But her presence was unmistakable. A child. He zoomed in instinctively, though the quality was poor. All he could see was dark, tousled hair and a soft pink sleeve. His mind raced, doing math without reason. Celia had been pregnant when he left. No, she couldn't have been. He would have known, wouldn't he? Unless she hadn't told him. Unless she'd found out after. Unless. He shut off the screen. This was ridiculous. It wasn't his business anymore. He had made his choice, and Celia had moved on. But the image refused to leave him. All day, he tried to bury it under emails and phone calls, under numbers and meetings and empty conversation. But none of it worked. For the first time in years, his focus fractured. By evening, he gave up pretending. He drove. He didn't know her new address. But the art fair in the photo had a location tag, a community center on the other side of town. He told himself he was just curious. That he wanted to see if she was okay. He didn't plan to talk to her. He just wanted something. A glimpse. Closure. The neighborhood was older, quieter. Not the kind of place he would have pictured her ending up, but somehow it felt fitting, charming, lived in, human. He parked across from the small building and waited. The sun had already started to fall behind the trees, casting long, sleepy shadows across the sidewalk. People came and went. A group of kids rode past on scooters. A couple with a stroller passed by, laughing softly. And then he saw her. She walked out of the community center, holding a small child on her hip. Andrew froze. It wasn't a guess anymore. The girl had her hair. Thick, dark, soft curls that framed her face like a halo. But it was the eyes that made his breath catch. Wide, brilliant blue. His eyes. Celia looked tired, but peaceful. She was dressed simply, jeans, a cardigan, a bag slung across her shoulder. She looked like someone who had stopped chasing and started living. The girl was talking excitedly, her small hand pointing at something across the street. Celia laughed, kissed the top of her head, and turned toward a nearby cafe. Andrew sat frozen behind the wheel, 1,000 thoughts crashing at once. He had questions. Too many. Why hadn't she told him? Why had she kept the child from him? Was it even possible? But beneath all that, deeper and quieter, was something else, guilt. He had left her. When she had been breaking, he had turned away. And now, she had built something beautiful without him. He didn't follow them into the cafe. He stayed in the car for nearly an hour after they disappeared inside, staring at the sidewalk, his heart a war zone. He thought he had moved on, believed he had chosen the life he wanted. But in that moment, watching his daughter's laughter bounce off the walls of the street, he realized he had walked away from more than a marriage. He had walked away from his family. And now he didn't know if he deserved to find a way back. The next morning, Andrew woke up with a tightness in his chest that no amount of coffee or logic could shake off. He had spent most of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself that what he saw wasn't real, or that even if it was, it didn't matter anymore. But the more he tried to suppress it, the more his thoughts unraveled. The little girl's face kept appearing behind his eyelids, her blue eyes full of life and curiosity, so achingly familiar that it almost hurt to recall. There was no more denying it. He had a daughter. And he didn't even know her name. By midday, the pressure inside him had turned into a kind of restless determination. He couldn't go another day without answers. Not out of entitlement, but because the weight of silence was unbearable. He had never been a man to avoid confrontation, and now that the confrontation involved his own flesh and blood, retreat was no longer an option. He called in sick for the first time in over a decade. He didn't have a plan, but he drove back to the same neighborhood, hoping for another chance. He parked outside the cafe and waited, watching the sidewalk like a man waiting for a miracle to repeat itself. Hours passed. People came and went. At one point he got out of the car, walked into the cafe, and ordered something just to blend in. He didn't ask about her. He couldn't bring himself to say her name aloud. Not yet. Late afternoon finally brought movement. Celia appeared again, this time walking alone with the little girl holding her hand. The child was skipping, humming something softly, her energy bounding ahead while Celia followed calmly. Andrew stepped out of the cafe, his heart pounding so loudly it felt like thunder inside his chest. He didn't know how to do this gently, so he did the only thing he could, he walked toward them. Celia saw him before he spoke. Her body stilled. Her hand instinctively tightened around the little girl's, and for a split second, she looked like she might run. But she didn't. Her eyes met his, steady and unreadable. Celia, he said, the name catching on his throat like a memory he hadn't spoken in years. She stood still, not speaking. The child looked up at him curiously, then back at her mother. "Hi," he added, softer now. "I didn't mean to scare you." "You're not scaring me," Celia said calmly. "Just, surprising me." There was a silence between them that stretched like fabric pulled too tight. "I saw you yesterday," Andrew admitted. "I didn't know you lived around here." I didn't know about her. At that, Celia's eyes darkened slightly, her expression tensing. "You didn't want to know. You made that choice a long time ago." He winced. "I didn't know you were pregnant when I left." "If I had." "If you had," she interrupted, her voice quiet but firm, "would you have stayed out of guilt or love?" That question hit him harder than he expected. He opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. The little girl looked up again, tugged gently on Celia's hand, and whispered something. Celia bent down and nodded before turning back to Andrew. "This is Lily," she said at last. "She's 3.5. She loves coloring, strawberry ice cream, and asking 10 questions in one breath. And no, she doesn't know who you are." Andrew's throat tightened. He knelt down slowly, careful not to overwhelm the girl, and offered a soft smile. "Hi, Lily," he said gently. She blinked at him, tilting her head slightly. "Are you Mommy's friend?" He glanced up at Celia, who gave no answer, then looked back at Lily and said, "I'd like to be." Lily smiled shyly, then hid behind her mother's legs. Celia let out a long sigh. "What are you doing here, Andrew?" "I don't know how to answer that in a way that doesn't sound selfish," he admitted. "I just saw you, and everything inside me shifted. I didn't come to demand anything. I came because I lost something I didn't even know I had, and I can't ignore that now. She looked at him for a long time, her face unreadable. Then she said, I don't know what you expect. I don't expect anything, he said. I'm not here to rewrite history. I want to know her. I want to know you again. If you'll let me. Celia didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at Lily, who was now twirling the edge of her dress and humming. Then she looked back up at him and said quietly, we go to the park every Saturday morning. If you want to come, you can. Andrew felt something inside him break open, something buried and forgotten, now suddenly breathing again. He nodded slowly, overwhelmed by the quiet permission in her voice. Thank you, he whispered. Celia gave a small, guarded nod, took Lily's hand, and turned to go. Andrew watched them walk away, the little girl bouncing along the pavement, and he realized that in all his years of chasing fortune and legacy, nothing had ever mattered more than the chance he had just been given. And this time, he wasn't going to run. Saturday morning arrived with a soft breeze and pale sunlight warming the sidewalks. Andrew was already awake before dawn, pacing his penthouse apartment as the city stirred to life below him. He hadn't felt this unsettled in years, not before a merger, not even before testifying in front of a Federal Trade Commission. This was different. This was personal. He had spent the entire week rehearsing what he might say, imagining different outcomes, preparing himself for rejection, confusion, even anger. What he hadn't prepared for was the weight of hope pressing so heavily on his chest. He arrived early at the park, dressed casually, something rare for him. A navy polo shirt, jeans, clean sneakers. He'd stood in front of the mirror twice, debating whether he looked approachable or like a man pretending to be someone he wasn't. In the end, he chose honesty. Let her see him as he was. A man who had made mistakes. A man who, despite all his success, had no idea how to fix what he had broken. The park was quiet, mostly filled with joggers and a few parents pushing strollers. He sat on a bench near the playground, watching the morning come to life. It wasn't long before he saw them, Celia and Lily, walking hand in hand down the path. Celia wore a simple gray sweater and light blue jeans. Her hair was pulled into a loose braid. Lily was in a soft yellow dress with tiny flowers embroidered along the hem, holding a small stuffed fox in one hand and skipping slightly with each step. Andrew stood as they approached, uncertain whether to smile or stay neutral. Celia gave him a short nod, polite but cautious. Lily didn't say anything at first. She looked at him curiously, clutching her fox a little tighter. I told her you might be here, Celia said. I didn't tell her who you were. That's okay, he said. I wouldn't even know how to explain it. There was an awkward pause, then Celia gestured toward the playground. She usually starts with the swings. Can I push her? He asked, unsure if he was overstepping. Celia looked at Lily. Do you want Mr. Andrew to push you? Lily considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. Only a little high, she said solemnly. Andrew smiled, following her to the swing set. He gently helped her into the seat, his hand surprisingly steady. It had been decades since he'd pushed a swing, but the motion came back naturally. With each push, Lily giggled louder, the kind of laugh that shook something loose inside him. Joy, real and messy and unfiltered. Celia stood nearby, watching them with folded arms. Not cold, but not relaxed either. Andrew knew she was still measuring him, weighing whether his return was genuine or convenient. And she had every right to. After a few minutes, Lily asked to get down. She ran off to the sandbox, and Andrew joined Celia on the bench. I didn't expect her to warm up to me so quickly, he said. She's open, Celia replied. But she's not naive. She picks up on more than people think. I don't want to confuse her, Andrew said quietly. I don't want to confuse you. Celia looked straight ahead, her voice measured. Then be honest. Don't promise more than you can give. I'm not here to make promises I can't keep, he said. But I want to try. I want to be in her life, even if it's slowly. You left, she said bluntly. You left me when everything was falling apart. And I carried all of it, alone. I was scared out of my mind. I almost didn't keep her. Those words hit harder than he anticipated. He turned toward her, eyes wide with shock. I'm not proud of that thought, Celia continued. But it's the truth. I was grieving the marriage, grieving what I thought was a broken body, and then suddenly I had a life growing inside me and no one to share it with. I didn't know, Andrew whispered. No, she said softly, you didn't. And I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to come back out of obligation. I wanted to protect her from a father who didn't know if he wanted to be one. Andrew stared at the ground, shame curling in his stomach like smoke. I wish I had stayed. I wish I had seen it through. Celia nodded, not unkindly. But you didn't. And I had to build something from that. I had to become someone new. So if you want to be in her life now, it has to be as the man you are today, not the one you were. He nodded slowly, understanding more in that moment than he had in years of therapy and boardroom self-reflection. I can do that. Or at least, I want to learn how. Celia turned to look at him, her eyes softer now. Then we'll start small. He looked over at Lily, who was now building a castle out of sand, her brow furrowed in determination. He couldn't believe he had missed so much. But he was here now. And for the first time in a very long time, Andrew Blake didn't feel like a man chasing a legacy. He felt like a father trying to earn a place in the world he never knew he'd wanted. As the morning unfolded, Lily came back to show them her castle, and Andrew crouched down beside her, genuinely impressed. Celia watched the two of them interact, careful, gentle, and almost familiar. She couldn't decide if it filled her with comfort or fear. Maybe both. But she knew one thing, something had shifted. And she wasn't ready to trust again, not yet, but she wasn't walking away either. The weeks that followed became a quiet rhythm Andrew hadn't known he needed. Every Saturday, without fail, he showed up to the park before Celia and Lily arrived. Sometimes he brought books for Lily, sometimes a coloring set, and once he even brought a tiny kite shaped like a fox after remembering the stuffed animal she always carried. Celia noticed the small efforts. She didn't comment, but she watched him closely, testing whether this consistency was just a phase, a performance, or something real. So far, it seemed real. And for Lily, it became something she looked forward to, something she trusted. She no longer hid behind her mother's legs when Andrew approached. Instead, she often ran up to him with stories of her week, proud drawings, or a new question about something completely random, why clouds were soft, or where turtles sleep at night. One Saturday, the air turned cooler, and the leaves had begun to change. Celia brought a blanket and a thermos of tea for them to share while Lily ran between piles of leaves, collecting the brightest ones to press in her notebook. Andrew sat beside Celia on the blanket, trying not to let the closeness make him say something premature. He knew this new phase between them was delicate. As they watched Lily balance on a fallen log, arms stretched like wings, Andrew finally asked something that had been circling in his mind since the day he met her. "What does she know about me?" he asked, careful not to let his voice shake. Celia hesitated, keeping her eyes on their daughter. "She knows that her dad left before she was born. That he didn't know she existed. She knows that I raised her alone, but that she was never unloved. And now, she knows that someone named Andrew is starting to become important in her life." He nodded, swallowing the weight of it. "Have you thought about telling her more?" "I've thought about everything," Celia said, and there was a tired truth in her voice that made him ache. "I thought about what it would do to her if you came and went. I thought about whether you'd confuse her. I even thought about lying and saying you were a family friend who moved away. But none of that seemed right. So now I'm just taking it one day at a time. Watching you. Watching her. Trying to figure out if this is something that's going to last. Andrew turned to look at her, his voice low. I'm not going anywhere. She gave him a long, searching look. You said that once before, remember? I do, he said honestly. And I broke that promise. But I'm not that man anymore. I didn't know what it meant to stay then. I thought love was about perfection, and when things got hard, I thought leaving meant strength. I was wrong. There was a pause, the kind filled with years of unsaid things. Lily ran over, interrupting them, her cheeks red from the wind and her hands full of leaves. She dropped them on the blanket with a proud smile. I'm gonna make a tree book, she declared. 1 page for each kind. Andrew grinned and helped her sort through them. That's a great idea. You'll be a leaf scientist. No, she giggled, a leaf queen. Celia laughed too, watching the exchange with a strange sense of calm. It had been so long since she'd seen Lily this open with anyone outside of her. Later that day, as they were packing up to leave, Lily suddenly turned to Andrew and asked, Can I tell my friends you're my friend too? Andrew crouched down to meet her eyes. You can tell them I'm your friend, he said carefully, and maybe one day, we'll be even more than that. Lily seemed to consider this deeply, then nodded and reached up to hug him without warning. It was small, quick, but it felt like the ground shifted beneath his feet. On the drive home, Celia didn't say much, but before he turned to go back to his car, she said softly, If you really mean to stay, you need to start building something with her. Not just on Saturdays. She needs more than promises. Andrew looked at her, almost afraid to be hopeful. Would you let me come by during the week? Help with dinner? Homework? Bedtime stories? Celia didn't answer right away. But then she nodded slowly. You can try. And that single word, try, meant more than any yes he had ever heard. Because it wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was the beginning of trust. And trust, Andrew realized, was worth everything he had to give. By the time October settled in, the evenings arrived sooner, and the air held a constant crispness that hinted at winter's approach. Andrew had slowly become a fixture in Celia and Lily's routine, like a bookend to their days, never overwhelming, never forcing himself in, just present in small and meaningful ways. He would stop by twice during the week, once for dinner and once just to help Lily with her bedtime routine. It wasn't always smooth. Sometimes Lily was tired and cranky, sometimes she ignored him altogether. But then there were moments, quiet, rare, powerful, where she reached for his hand during a bedtime story or asked him to stay a little longer. And every time she did, something inside Andrew shifted further into place. Celia, too, began to relax, though she never said as much out loud. The first few visits had been cautious, almost clinical. She set boundaries. She stayed in the room when he read to Lily. She reminded him gently not to promise anything he couldn't keep. But as the weeks passed, she stopped hovering. She'd step away to the kitchen while he helped Lily brush her teeth. She let him carry Lily to bed when she fell asleep on the couch. And once, without realizing it, she let him wash the dishes while she sat quietly at the table, watching the steam rise from her tea. It was during one of those evenings that something unexpected happened. Lily had gone to bed early after a long day at preschool, and Celia and Andrew found themselves alone in the living room. There was soft jazz playing from an old speaker in the corner, and the lamps cast warm pools of light across the shelves and old wooden floor. Celia curled up in her armchair, a blanket around her legs, while Andrew sat on the edge of the couch, a mug of tea in his hand. They talked more freely now. Not just about Lily, but about everything, her paintings, the classes she'd taken over the years, the small gallery that had once featured her work. He listened, really listened, in a way he never had before. Back then, he had always been distracted by a meeting, an email, some crisis that felt more urgent than what was right in front of him. Now, he found himself hanging on to every word she spoke, quietly stunned by how much he had missed, about her, about the life they might have had. After a lull in the conversation, Celia looked at him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. "Why now?" she asked. "After all this time. What changed?" Andrew took a long breath. I finally stopped running from everything I didn't want to face. I kept myself so busy building things, growing the company, chasing success, because I thought that would fill the space. But it didn't. I was always empty. Always angry. But then I saw you. And her. And everything inside me cracked open." Celia didn't speak for a while. She just watched him, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her cup. "You weren't the only one who broke," she said eventually. "But I didn't have the luxury of running. I had to grow up all at once. I was terrified. But Lily made me brave." He nodded. "She's making me brave too." There was a kind of silence between them then, not awkward, but heavy with something unspoken. It was the weight of grief, of time lost, of paths that should have gone differently but somehow still led them here. Eventually, Celia stood and gathered her cup. "I'm glad she has you now," she said simply. "I never wanted to keep her from you. I just didn't know if you were someone I could trust with her heart." "I didn't know either," Andrew said quietly. That night, he left later than usual. When he reached the front door, he turned back to her and hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up. "Of course. Do you think I'll ever be forgiven?" Celia's expression softened, but there was no easy answer in her eyes. "Forgiveness isn't a door, Andrew. It's a hallway. You've started walking through it. That matters." The next morning, Andrew woke to a text from Celia. It was a photo of Lily, still in her pajamas, holding up a drawing she'd made. The picture was simple, 3 stick figures standing under a tree. One had brown hair, one had blue eyes, and in the middle, a little girl with a bright yellow dress and a crooked smile. Underneath, written in large, uneven letters, were the words, "My family." He stared at the photo for a long time, the corners of his mouth lifting into a smile that reached all the way to the part of him that had once gone numb. He had a long way to go. But for the first time, he knew exactly where he was headed. It was early November when things began to shift in a way Andrew hadn't expected. The days were shorter now, darkness falling quickly in the late afternoons, and with it came a certain stillness that seemed to settle into their lives like a gentle hush. Lily had started asking more questions, about the past, about where Andrew lived, about why he hadn't always been there. She wasn't accusatory. She was simply curious, as only a child could be, sensing that something about her world had changed and wanting to make sense of it. Andrew did his best to answer honestly without giving her more than she could carry. He told her that sometimes grown-ups made mistakes, and that the biggest mistake he ever made was not knowing about her sooner. He told her that he had missed a lot of her life, but that he wanted to be there for every moment he could from now on. Lily listened carefully, her small face serious, and then, after a pause, she had asked if he would come to her school's family day. He had said yes immediately, without hesitation. The event wasn't grand, just a morning of classroom activities, songs, and crafts where parents or guardians came in to spend time with the children. But for Andrew, it might as well have been a summit with world leaders. He had spent his entire life in rooms of power, yet none had made his palms sweat the way the idea of sitting in a circle with preschoolers did. Still, he showed up early, carrying a tray of homemade cookies he had barely managed to bake the night before after watching 3 YouTube tutorials and nearly setting off his apartment's smoke alarm. Lily was already in the classroom when he arrived, wearing a pale blue dress and her favorite sneakers with stars on the sides. She ran up to him, arms outstretched, and hugged him without hesitation. Celia was there too, standing off to the side, watching with a quiet smile that said more than words ever could. She hadn't told him he had to come. She hadn't even reminded him the night before. But when she saw him standing in that brightly colored room, holding his uneven cookies and nervously straightening his sleeves, something in her softened even more. During the event, Lily proudly introduced Andrew as her special person. When one of the other children asked if he was her dad, she hesitated only a second before saying, "Yes. He's my daddy now." Andrew's heart clenched at those words, the finality of them, the unquestioning acceptance. Celia had looked over when she heard it, her expression unreadable for a moment before she gave him the slightest nod. Not permission exactly, but acknowledgement. Later that afternoon, back at Celia's apartment, the three of them sat on the living room floor, surrounded by craft paper and glue sticks, admiring the drawings Lily had brought home. There was one she had made that day, a picture of a house, a sun, and three people standing hand in hand. Celia had long hair, Andrew had tall shoulders and blue eyes, and Lily stood between them, her smile big and her crayon crown slightly crooked. "I want us all to live together someday," Lily said casually as she colored in the grass. "So I don't have to say goodbye at bedtime." Neither Andrew nor Celia responded right away. The moment was too fragile, too real. Andrew looked at Celia, uncertain what he was allowed to hope for. He didn't want to rush anything. But he also didn't want to pretend he didn't long for that too. That evening, after Lily had fallen asleep, he lingered a little longer than usual. Celia walked him to the door as always, but this time she didn't open it right away. Instead, she leaned against the wall, arms crossed, her gaze meeting his. "She's starting to expect you," she said softly. "It's no longer a surprise when you show up. It's part of her world now." "I know," he replied. "That's what I want." "And what if something happens? What if you get scared again? What if your life pulls you back into that world of meetings and travel and late nights?" "I've already stepped out of that world," Andrew said, his voice steady. "I've turned down projects. I've started saying no. And for the first time, it doesn't feel like I'm losing anything. It feels like I'm finally building something real." Celia watched him for a long moment before nodding. "She's not the only one who's starting to expect you." That admission, small as it was, hit him like a wave. He didn't kiss her that night. He didn't ask to stay. But when he left, he walked away with a hope he hadn't dared to hold before. The hallway to forgiveness, as Celia had once called it, was long. But step by step, he was moving forward. Not with words or promises, but with presence. With proof. And sometimes, that was the bravest kind of love there was. Winter came quietly that year, blanketing the city in soft gray skies and a hush that seemed to wrap itself around everything. For the first time in years, Andrew found the cold comforting rather than isolating. There was something peaceful about the way the world slowed down, how people leaned into warmth, into each other. His life, once filled with noise and motion, had become something simpler, measured not in profits or deadlines, but in bedtime stories, warm dinners, and unexpected moments of laughter. He had started spending evenings at Celia's more regularly, helping with Lily's nighttime routine, sometimes cooking, sometimes just being present. At first, it had felt like visiting someone else's life, beautiful, but temporary. Now, it was beginning to feel like his own. There was a mug with his name on it in the cupboard. Lily had drawn his face next to hers on the family calendar. And Celia no longer stood between him and the stove when he cooked. It wasn't dramatic. It was the slow, almost imperceptible unfolding of trust. One night, just before Christmas, Lily fell asleep curled between them on the couch after watching a holiday movie, her fingers still sticky with melted marshmallows. Celia looked over at Andrew, her eyes tired but soft, and whispered, "She calls you Dad when I'm not around. She says it like it's always been true." Andrew couldn't speak for a moment. He simply looked at the small, sleeping figure between them and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for so long, peace, purpose, and something close to redemption. As the year came to a close, so did many of the questions that had once haunted them. Celia no longer held herself back from small touches, her hand brushing against his when passing him a dish, her shoulder leaning into his on cold evenings. And Andrew no longer walked into her home with hesitation. He brought groceries without being asked. He fixed the broken light in the hallway without making it a grand gesture. It was these quiet acts that made Celia begin to believe him. Not because he said the right things, but because he had learned to show up without needing to be praised for it. On New Year's Eve, Celia invited him to stay for the night. It wasn't romantic, not in the traditional sense. She simply said, "You're part of this now. If you're tired, stay." He nodded, and that night he tucked Lily into bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Happy New Year, sweetheart," before returning to the living room, where Celia waited in her robe, a cup of tea in her hands. They didn't talk about the past that night. They didn't dissect what had gone wrong or weigh the pain against what they had now. They just sat side by side, watching the fireworks bloom quietly in the distance through the frosted window. And when midnight came, he turned to her, not with grand intentions or carefully crafted words, but with honesty. "I don't know where we're going from here," he said. "But I know I never want to go back." Celia looked at him, then leaned in gently, resting her head against his shoulder. "Then don't," she whispered. "Just stay." And so he did. By spring, he had quietly moved into the spare room. Lily was the one who declared it Daddy's room, before either of the adults had discussed it aloud. They let her lead the way. That was how it had always been, letting the little girl who had unknowingly saved them both be the compass that brought them home. There were no proposals, no fairy tale endings wrapped in bows. Just days filled with small promises kept, routines shared, and a love that grew not from perfection, but from presence. Andrew had once believed legacy was built in boardrooms, in towers that bore his name. Now he knew it was in moments like this, teaching Lily how to ride a bike, folding Celia's paint-stained apron over the back of a chair, eating pancakes on lazy Sunday mornings. He hadn't just been forgiven. He had been transformed. Not by words, but by the relentless, daily act of showing up. And that, he realized, was what love really was. Not grand. Not sudden. But steady. A second chance, given freely, earned fully. A story rewritten, one page at a time. As the author of this story, I see the ending not as a happily ever after in the traditional sense, but as something deeper and more honest, a redemption that was earned slowly, quietly, through humility and presence. Andrew didn't win Celia and Lily back with grand gestures or flawless apologies, he rebuilt trust one small, consistent action at a time. That, to me, is far more powerful than any dramatic twist or perfect romance. This ending matters because it reflects real life, messy, painful, often uncertain, but full of hope when people choose to grow. Forgiveness isn't magic, it's a process. And love, at its most meaningful, is shown in how we stay, not in how we return. That's the heart of this story.